Welcome you all to this lesson, class session on the book of Exodus, which we are continuing. Briefly to recall where we had stopped last time. If you remember, we had stopped the class last time in the book of Exodus, chapter 12. And we said the crossing of the Red Sea and the Israelites passing from the land of Egypt to the land of freedom requires a couple of explanations, so that we will postpone that to the next session. So today we take up that. For those of you who have the Bible in front of you, kindly open the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 37 onwards. So that is from where we start our explanations today. Book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 37 onwards. Evidently, I'm not reading the entire chapters. I just bring to your attention a few points of clarification, presuming that you have read it already in the context of the class, or even otherwise with your knowledge of the Bible, you must have read it quite a few times. So I just pause for a couple of explanations. Well, chapter 12, verse 37 onwards, up to chapter 15, we have got this description of Israelites passing over, they crossing the Red Sea and passing over to the freedom from the slavery, and which concludes with two songs of victory, one from Moses and one short hymn from the sister of Moses called Miriam. And now, when we read these passages, some explanations that are required, I bring to your attention. These are not very spiritual explanations, but some kind of scientific explanation, which will certainly help us to better appreciate what the Bible says, and which might also be a help for us to answer when some people ask certain questions about the narrations in the Bible. So the first one, book of Exodus chapter 12 verse 37 onwards, you read, and we will find there the reference to the number of people which passed from the land of Egypt to the land of promise or land of freedom under the leadership of Moses. So we pause for a while just to explain a little bit about that number of people. The Bible says 600,000 men, without counting children and evidently women as well. So 600,000 men formed the group which was under the leadership of Moses. Now, 600,000 men is, you would all agree with me if I say that's a very, very huge number. Normally, we would call it as 6 lakhs men. Now, when if we have to take literally what Bible says, 600,000 or 6 lakhs men without counting the children, and presumably without counting the women as well. So if you include the women, the basic statistics would tell us, let's not go into the discussion as to whether men counted more or women counted more. Let's go by the normal thinking, women equal number of men. So therefore 6 lakhs men, and we would add another 6 lakhs women. So 12 lakhs people. Then if we add a minimum of another 6 lakhs children, that would make it 18 lakhs of people passing over the sea and passing across the desert. And remember, for 40 years, not just for 1 or 2 days, and under one leader, Moses. Now, when I say that 18 lakhs people, we will certainly have our mind blown out. How is it possible at all? Such a huge, unimaginably huge number of people. Now, you just imagine crossing one particular point. Even if they cross not one by one in a big crowd, 18 lakhs people to cross one particular point. And remember, they had also brought their flocks, their herds, their sheep, their cattle, and their birds, and all that. Can you ever imagine such a huge crowd with all their properties journeying for 40 years under the leadership of one man? How could ever what Moses spoke be heard by people? So that causes a little bit of a surprise, a little bit of a doubt. Now, of course, there are there are explanations for the same. But before we go to the explanations, we ask the question, could the Hebrews have numbered such a huge number at the time of the leaving Egypt? I repeat the question. Could the Israelites have numbered such a huge number, such a big number at the time they left Egypt? Now, if you remember, and I'm sure certainly you remember, Exodus chapter 1 verses 1 to 5. Book of Exodus chapter 1 verses 1 to 5 had told us that 70 people came under the leadership of Jacob and Joseph and originally settled in Egypt. 70 people, 70 people. Now, how long did they stay in Egypt? These 70 people, how long did they stay before they could leave the country? There are different traditions about how long they stayed. And when I say different traditions, I mean the biblical traditions. For example, Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, when God was promising Abraham, God had told Abraham that I would bring out your descendants from the land of Egypt in the 4th generation. So from that, Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, we might conclude that one tradition said Israelites remained in the land of Egypt for 4 generations. And the other tradition you will notice in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, once again. Again, it is from the mouth of God while God is promising Abraham. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where it is said Israelites would remain in Egypt for 400 years. 400 years. A similar tradition we will also find in book of Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. Book of Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 says the Israelites remain in the land of Egypt for 430 years. 430 years. So basically 2 traditions. One tradition which says they remained for 4 generations, and the other tradition which says they remained for 430 years or 400 years at the maximum. Now, whether how these different traditions came up, I suppose by now those who are regularly following the class would remember I had said quite a few times earlier as well, in the final combination of the book Pentateuch, the 5 books of the first 5 books of the Bible, there may have been different traditions joined together, coupled together, and as a result we have the final form of the Pentateuch. Well, these different traditions joined together, all inspired by God. That part we are never doubting or questioning, all because of the inspiration of God. So because of that, maybe these 2 traditions or 2 references to the time duration for which the Israelites stayed in Egypt came. Whatever be the reason, now we just look at it rationally. 70 people are those who came and settled in Egypt. Could these 70 people, let us take the maximum number of years, 4 generations may be a shorter time, let us take the maximum number of years, 430 years. Could the 70 people become a number of 18 lakhs after 430 years? Genetically speaking, that is not just possible. That could not have become such in spite of the fact that the book of Genesis says that the Israelites multiplied very fast. However fast they multiplied in the time gap of 430 years, 70 people could not have multiplied up to 18 lakhs of people. So humanly speaking, we find a certain impossibility there. Another difficulty we observe is we have got extra biblical accounts or documents of the ancient time. And one of the documents, extra biblical, that means the other civil documents which we have got, tells us in the first century BC, that is the first century just before the birth of Jesus, in the first century BC, the entire population of Egypt counted at 7 lakhs people. Men, women, children, all counted. The entire population of the people of Egypt counted 7 lakhs people in the first century BC. So once again, we have this doubt or question. If the entire population of Egypt was only 7 lakhs people in the first century BC, what about the Exodus time, that is somewhere 13th century BC, almost 1,300 years before this census. So in the 13th century BC, population of the entire Egypt could have been much less than 7 lakhs. The entire Egypt could have the population of the entire Egypt certainly would have been much less than 7 lakhs people in 13th century BC when the Exodus took place. So if in the 13th century BC the entire population in Egypt was much less than 7 lakhs people, how could the group of slaves in that land count 18 lakhs people? So that also, humanly speaking, is not acceptable. So if that is the case, how do we explain this? Reference in the book of Exodus chapter 12 verse 37 onwards, saying that 600,000 people left Egypt, not counting children and women. Well, there are a few biblical explanations. One explanation is, in the Bible today we read 600,000 men. 600,000 men. In ordinary language, we would say it is 6 lakhs. But this word 1,000, what is translated as 1,000, in Hebrew language, the word is elef. Maybe there are a few who know some Hebrew, if there are somebody who is working in Israel or Jordan and so on. So the word used in the Bible, of course, the biblical Hebrew is not always the same as the modern Hebrew, which they use now. Keeping that difference in mind, the word which is used in the Hebrew Bible, which is translated as 1,000, is elef. Now this Hebrew word elef can have two meanings. It can mean 1,000, but it can also mean a clan. C-L-A-N, a clan. Not exactly a tribe, much smaller than a tribe. A tribe is a bigger group of people. A clan is a small group of people. A clan, C-L-A-N. Now, if we look at the book of Exodus, chapter 6, verse 15, we find this word Elef, Hebrew word Elef, is translated as a clan. So it is clear that the word Elef can be translated either as 1,000 or as clan. So therefore, taking that interpretation into Exodus chapter 12, verse 37 onwards, there is this possibility of reading 600,000 men as 600 clan of men. 600 clan of men. A clan, as I said, is a small group of people, maybe consisting of 20 or 25 people, a clan. So 20 or 25 people, a clan. So multiply 25 into 600. The number comes much less than 6 lakhs. And obviously that will lead us to a number much less than 18 lakhs. Of course, taking this 1,000 as clan, we have got one small difficulty. That is, here the Bible clearly says 600 men without counting children. So if you call it as a clan, or if you understand that as a clan, evidently children and women are included in that clan. But probably some people say 600 clan was the original reading. Without counting children was later on added to it. What is the reason? That we will see a little later. So that is one explanation. To summarize, I repeat, instead of reading 600,000 men, we have a possibility of reading that as 600 clan, A clan would be a group of people consisting more or less 20 or 25. So if you multiply 25 into 600, we get a number much less than 6 lakhs people. Another explanation is the 600,000 men. In that expression, the word thousand was not there originally. It was an addition by a later generation of people. Sometimes we do agree that some minor additions and subtractions have taken place in the Bible. Of course, in the ancient time, before it came to be in the written form. Once it was fixed in the written form, additions and subtractions were not taking place. But as it was existing in the oral form, you remember all the ancient texts originally started in the oral form, communicated through the word of mouth. It came to be written down in a later time. So when the Bible existed in the oral form, probably this 1,000 was added later on. Originally, the text only read 600 men. That is a very reasonable number. 600 men. Let us add another 600 women. So it would be 1,200 adults. And we add another 600 or 800 children. So it would be around 2,000 people. And with their flocks, their heads. That is a very, very manageable number of people. And remember, that is slave people, a group of people. So in the desert for 40 years to travel, and for them to find food, water, of course, God was providing them. So what I'm trying to say is, if we find 1,000 as a later addition, and original text read 600 men, that would lead us to a very reasonable and manageable number of people. We might ask a question, how such additions or what could have been translated as clan also came to be translated as 1,000. How this changes, or how this reality, why this reality took place. That is to be understood in the background of the psychology of the ancient people. Psychology of the ancient people, whenever they speak about their traditional texts, or whenever they speak about their origin, or whenever they speak about their religion, they did have a tendency of exaggerating a little bit. Of course, today also people have the tendency of exaggerating, but in the ancient time, when they narrate about their ancestry, particularly when they speak about their ancestry to the future generation and to the future people, they have this tendency of exaggerating a little bit. We did say about this when we read the book of Genesis chapter 12, and we noticed there the biblical writer saying, when Sarah at the age of 65 went to Egypt, she was found to be the most beautiful woman in the entire land of Egypt. Evidently, Sarah to be found as the most beautiful woman when she was 65 years old in the entire land of Egypt is a little bit of an exaggeration, where the ancient people manifest this tendency of making their ancestry very great, very big. So here also, the later people, when they were narrating their ancestry to the future generation and to the other people, saying that under the leadership of Moses, around 2,000 people came out, or 600 men came out, they may have found a little below their dignity, or little below the greatness with which they want to present their ancestry. So they wanted to a little bit of blow out or blow up the image, or they want to exaggerate a little bit of their ancestry, and therefore they added this. So that is one rational explanation. Please don't misunderstand me thinking that I am giving a different explanation in the entire Bible and misleading you or misrepresenting the message of God. Certainly no. Now, our point here is the message of God is very inspired. That is never to be negated. The message of God is always very important, and we cannot dilute the message of God. But the narration of the message of God, sometimes the human words come in. So the message and the narration of it has to be separated. Just like you look at the parables in the gospel. Jesus narrates story in the form of parables, and the details of the story is not that which is important. The most important thing is the message which Jesus wants to communicate through the parable. So therefore, we have to make a distinction between the message of the parable and the details of the parable. Similarly, here also in the Old Testament, particularly in the book, in the collection of the book of Pentateuch, sometimes we have to make a distinction between the inspired message of God and the way the inspired message of God gets narrated. So make a distinction between the narration details and the message itself. Message is absolutely not to be negated, not to be diluted. Message is God intervened so powerfully to save the people of slavery. God intervened so powerfully to save the people of slavery, and we will see later on how providential God's interventions have been. So that is not negated, but some minor details. How many people? That is not very important for our faith. Our faith does not depend on the fact exactly how many number of people came out. Our faith depends on the fact that God brought out the people. What exactly was the number of the people is not a matter of faith, not necessarily. So therefore, in case some people raise this rational question to you, oh, the Bible is all cock and bull story. It is impossible. How can 6 lakhs men and their cattle and their women and their children go travel for 40 years in a desert, and from where to find the food for them? That is just unimaginable, irrational. Some people say that to you, and you yourself get doubts. Remember, there are such explanations which does not call into question the providence of God, the power of God, the intervention of God, which only enables us to better understand the narrative details of the text. Another element which requires a little bit of an explanation is about the route which the people took when they left for Exodus, or when they left Egypt. What was the route which they took in order to go from Egypt to Palestine, to the land of Canaan? Why did they take 40 years to travel? On a normal course of journey, we will all remember journeying between Egypt and Palestine, Egypt and Canaan, would not have taken 40 years at all, because you know that was a usually traveled route. Between, there was regular journeying between land of Canaan and Egypt. There was regularly people going up and down. We remember book of Genesis chapter 12 and also later on in chapter 26 and 20 and so on. When there was famine in the land of Canaan, people immediately traveled to Egypt. It would take at the most a couple of days. You also remember in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew, when there was a danger to the life of the infant Jesus, the Holy Family immediately fled to Egypt, and afterwards they came back. So traveling between the land of Canaan and Egypt would not have by all means taken 40 years, and that was such a short journey. But that's not what we read about the journey of the people of Israel. So why did it happen? How did it happen? How to understand? Well, for a journey between Palestine and Egypt, or a journey between the land of Canaan and Egypt, or from Egypt to the land of Canaan, in the ancient time, in the biblical time, there were 4 possibilities, 4 possible routes. Today things are different, but in those days there were 4 possible routes. In a class like this, I cannot show the map of the ancient Near East. Otherwise, I could have demonstrated to you. But I guess you will have some facility to come across the map of the ancient time, ancient Near East. Okay, 4 different routes possible. One route was that which is called as the way of Philistines. The way of Philistines. Now that path passed along the Mediterranean Sea. I hope you have some idea of the geography of this land. There is the Egypt, and there is the land of Palestine. and along in the border of land of Palestine, there is the Mediterranean Sea. So from Egypt, on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, there is a passage which would lead to the land of Canaan, and that passage is called as the Way of the Philistines. It is called as the Way of the Philistines because the group of people called the Philistines were residing between Egypt and the land of Canaan. So the people, whoever passed, had to cut across the land of Philistines. So therefore, it was called as the Way of the Philistines. That was the shortest route, and that was the normal route people would take to travel up and down. But Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 says, God did not intentionally lead people through the way of the Philistines. Exodus chapter 13, verse 17, God intentionally did not lead Israelites through this way of Philistines. Why? Because God thought right at the beginning of their journey, when they come across Philistines, so obviously there will be a battle. Philistines would not allow such a one or two people passing, that's okay, but such a huge group of people passing, they would definitely find them as a threat to the security of the nation. So there would be a battle, there would be a war, there would be a fight, there would be a block. So God thought right at the beginning of their journey, if they come across a battle, a war, then there is a possibility of the people getting discouraged and turning back to Egypt. So therefore, in order to safeguard the people from that, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines. So that was the first route possible. The second route possible was that which is called as the way of Shur. The way of Shur. S-H-U-R. The way of Shur. Now, this way of Shur, from Egypt, they will have to go across that which is called as the Negev Desert. N-E-G-E-V. The Negev Desert. And from the Negev Desert, they reach Kadesh Barnea, a place in the desert. And from Kadesh Barnea, they can enter the land of Canaan. So that was a little longer than the way of the Philistines, but still that was not a very long way. That also was possible. They can avoid the Philistines. They can come to the Negev Desert. From the Negev Desert, go to Kadesh Barnea. From Kadesh Barnea, enter the land of Canaan. The third possible route was that which is called as the way of Mount Seir. The way of Mount Seir. Seir, the spelling is S-E-I-R. The way of Mount Seir. Now, this was in the ancient time the way of the commercial route, where the commercial people for transactions for business would travel between Egypt and Babylonia or Babylon or Mesopotamia. So not to the land of Canaan. So this was a way, the commercial route which the business people used to travel by to go across Egypt to Babylon or Babylonia, or from Babylonia to Egypt. Of course, we can pass from Egypt to this way of Mount Seir and reach Mount Seir. And from there, one can go to Kadesh Barnea. And from Kadesh Barnea, once again, one can enter the land of Canaan. So that possibility was there. Probably God wanted to lead them by this way because they had to reach Mount Seir, that is nearby there. There is the Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai or Sinai, and God had appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai, which is also called as Mount Horeb. So they had to offer a sacrifice there. So instead of going by the land of Philistines, because God did not want people into battle right at the beginning, instead of going by the way of the Shur, God may have thought of leading them to the way of Mount Seir, so that they can also go to Mount Sinai and worship God there and set up the covenant, and from there proceed to Kadesh Barnea, and from Kadesh Barnea enter the land of Canaan. That must have been the original purpose of God. But we realize even that did not get fulfilled. Yes, they went to Mount Sinai, but from Mount Sinai they reached Kadesh Barnea. From there, Moses sent spies. We know that from the book of Numbers. Book of Numbers would tell us Moses sent spies, and the spies returned with a very negative report, and people started rebelling, and God punished the people. You go back to the wilderness and roam around or roam about in the wilderness for 40 years. So that way is called as the way of wilderness. Cut across from Egypt to Mount Sinai, and then from Mount Sinai go to Kadesh Barnea. From Kadesh Barnea, return to the wilderness, travel across the entire wilderness desert, and come to the river Jordan. Take a very, very roundabout way. Come to the river Jordan, and river Jordan you cut across and enter the land of Canaan. So that is how the Exodus took such a long time. And the reasons we know, this such a long time was taken because people disobeyed, rebelled against God, and it was a part of their punishment. We will speak a little about it later on when it comes to the book of Numbers, and when we speak about that. So that is with regard to clarity concerning the route of the Exodus. I repeat, there were 4 routes possible: way of Philistines, way of Shur, way of Sair, and the way of wilderness. God took the people by the way of wilderness, and the reasons are the ones that we said just now. A third point to be clarified. The first thing to be clarified was the number of the people who traveled. The second point to be clarified was the way which they took in their Exodus. And the third point to be clarified was where did they cut across from Egypt to the wilderness? Where did they cut across from Egypt to wilderness? Our popular thinking always tells us they crossed the Red Sea. They crossed the Red Sea to cut across from Egypt, to pass over from Egypt to the wilderness. They crossed the Red Sea. Those of you who have some idea of the geography of the Near East, Egypt, even today's geography, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. Those who have some idea of the geography of that, both in the present time and in the ancient time, we will remember that actually to pass over from Egypt to the wilderness where Mount Sinai is found, one does not have to cut across the Red Sea as it is found today. One does not have crossed the Red Sea to pass from Egypt to the Mount Sinai. There are the other ways. Even if one is to follow the way of wilderness, as we said, one does not have to pass the Red Sea. At the Red Sea, you remember in the geography, it has got 2 branches at the end of it. One is called the Canal of Suez, Suez Canal, and the other is called the Suez Aqaba. So Mount Sinai comes somewhere in between the Suez Canal and the Suez Aqaba. So maximum one has to cross will be the Suez Canal, not the Red Sea. And even the Suez Canal, one does not have to necessarily cross. Look at the geography or map of the ancient Near East. And from Egypt, you have a way of going to the Mount Sinai without even cutting across the Suez Canal. So what do we say about the popular belief and what the Bible says? They crossed the Red Sea, and that is one of the most important miracles which any Israel or which any Christian for that matter would not like to doubt at all. One of the most important miracles, God intervened so powerfully. Well, once again, if you have the habit of reading English Bible, and I suppose many of you would be reading English Bible, and that too NRSV Bible, NRSV version, each time they speak about the Red Sea in the English Bible, you will notice a footnote reference there. Later on, when you find the Red Sea references in the book of Exodus, please note there will be a footnote reference. And in that footnote, each time the Bible clarifies, the Hebrew original reads, Reed Sea. I repeat, each time the English Bible will give us this footnote clarification that the Hebrew Bible, instead of Red Sea, though that is what is written in English Bible, and obviously in the vernacular language Bibles, the translation of that. But the footnote explanation says Hebrew Bible does not read Red Sea, but the Hebrew Bible says Reed Sea. Now, what is this Reed Sea? My dear brothers and sisters, let us keep in mind the Hebrew Bible in its original text actually says Israelites under the leadership of Moses crossed Yam Suf. That's the Hebrew expression, Yam Suf. Yam in Hebrew language means sea. Now this word Suf, S-U-P-H, that is a transliteration of the Hebrew. The word Suf in Hebrew language means actually reed, R-E-E-D, reed, not red. So Hebrew Bible says the Israelites crossed Reed Sea, and that came to be translated as Red Sea in the English Bible. The reason for that translation I will say a little later. So come back to the original Hebrew text. Hebrew Bible is saying the Israelites crossed Yam Suf, which means Reed Sea. Now, what is this reed? Reed is a kind of a slender plant, a plant that grows mainly in the marshy ground, marshy land where there is a lot of water and mud and so on mixed up. You understand what is meant by a marshy land. So reed is a slender plant that grows in the marshy land. And in the ancient time, at the tip of the Suez Canal, the Canal of Suez, at the tip of the Suez Canal, there were a few lakes, bitter lakes and dark lakes and so on. They were called a few lakes. And because these few lakes and this Suez Canal comes close by or nearby, that entire area was a marshy land, and plenty of reeds were growing in that. And in the ancient time, that whole area was called as the Reed Sea. Also, the Suez Canal was called as the Reed Sea. Suez Canal also was called as the Reed Sea. The Canal of Aqaba, the other branch of parallel to the Suez Canal, that also was called as the Reed Sea. So I repeat, in the ancient time, that particular area which comes at the border of Egypt, dividing that from the wilderness that comes afterwards, there were these couple of lakes and the Suez Canal, and because they all come nearby, that entire area was a marshy land, and in that marshy land, plenty of reed plants were growing. As a result, that whole area was called as the Reed Sea, Yam Suf. And most probably, that is the area which the people of Israel crossed under the leadership of Moses. That is the area which the people of Israel crossed under the leadership of Moses. Another reason I say that is the area where the people of Israel crossed, because the Bible book of Exodus gives us itinerary of the people of Israel when they set out on Exodus. Bible very clearly tells us from which place they started, which place they reached, from there where they proceeded, and so on. I just bring to your attention a few references. Chapter 12, verse 37. Chapter 12, verse 37, and book of Exodus, of course. Book of Exodus, chapter 13, verse 20. Chapter 13, verse 20. Book of Exodus, chapter 15, verse 22. Chapter 15, verse 22. So kindly, when you get time later on, read these passages. I repeat, Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, Exodus chapter 13, verse 20, Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. We also read Exodus chapter 14, verse 2. Exodus chapter 14, verse 2. So from these references, we get a basic idea of the journey steps of the people of Israel. They started from a place called Ramesses, ancient Egypt place, Ramesses. And from Ramesses, they proceeded to Sukkot. From Sukkot, they proceeded to Etham, and from Etham, they proceeded to the wilderness of Shur. So that is the itinerary of the people of Israel when they left Egypt under the leadership of Moses. I repeat, they started from Ramesses, they proceeded to Sukkot. From Sukkot, they proceeded to Etham, and from Etham, they crossed over to the wilderness of Shur. So in this itinerary, which the Bible itself says, the Red Sea, which comes far below, does not enter at all. At the most, what will come is that which is called as the Reed Sea, and maybe the tip of the Suez Canal as well. You also notice Exodus chapter 14 verse 12, or Exodus chapter 14 verse 2, where God clearly tells Moses to take the people of Israel and make them camp in front of the sea, so that the Egyptians will have a misunderstanding. They will think that the people have lost their way and they are in front of the sea now. They cannot cross the sea, so we can easily go and catch them. So Pharaoh will send the army behind the Israelites to bring them back. So God clearly told Moses, go and camp in front of the sea. Which sea is that? Most probably, according to all the descriptions in the Bible and according to the Hebrew expression used in the Bible, Moses was asked by God to make the people camp in front of the Reed Sea, Yam Suf. Well, if they crossed the Reed Sea, what is the miracle there? Could be the other question. Well, we must remember, even if it is the Reed Sea, normal conditions, it is not possible to cross that, because it is such a marshy land, lot of water, and reeds are growing. In a marshy land, you will certainly get drowned. You can't cut across a marshy land with full of water. Especially, you can't cross the marshy land if it is time of a high tide. And since there is the vicinity or nearness of the Suez Canal, and on the other side, there is the vicinity or the nearness of Mediterranean Sea, and a little far below, there is the vicinity of the Red Sea. So because of all these water sources coming together, at the time of high tide, even in the normal time, it was impossible to go across the Red Sea. Humanly speaking, it is not possible. So we are not doubting, or we don't have any reason to doubt about the miracle aspect. God did perform a wonderful act. God did intervene and manifested his power in making a path, a dry ground in the Red Sea, and letting the Israelites cross the Red Sea safely. Whereas when the Egyptians came behind, they all got drowned and they died. They all perished there. So the miracle aspect is very, very sure. There is no doubt about it. God did perform a miracle. God did intervene. God manifested his power. But the only question we ask is, which was the place in which God manifested the power? Was it in the Red Sea or was it in the Reed Sea? All the narrations in the Bible and even our understanding of the geography of the ancient time will lead us to conclude God manifested this extreme sign of power, this miraculous power of God manifested in the Red Sea, may not be in the Red Sea. Now, if that is the case, how did the whole this translation of Red Sea come about? What was Red Sea? How did it come about to be translated as Red Sea? That change in the translation, they say, took place with the Greek translation of the Bible. You will have certainly heard, I remember, I think, because you may have had introduction to the Bible, some classes. So in that you may have heard, there was this Hebrew Bible called as the Masoretic text, which was later on translated into Greek language almost 200 or 300 years before Jesus. So in the 3rd century BC, the Hebrew Bible was translated into the Greek language, and the Greek Bible was called as Septuagint Bible. So when the Hebrew Bible, that is much before the birth of Jesus, I repeat, so when the Hebrew Bible was translated into the Greek Bible, Septuagint Bible, the Septuagint Bible translated Red Sea, not as Red Sea, but as Red Sea. The Septuagint Bible used the word thalassa erythra. The Greek Bible used the expression thalassa erythra. Thalassa means sea and erythra means red. So since the Greek Bible, Septuagint Bible translated the Red Sea into Red Sea, Thalassa Erythra, afterwards all other translations followed this Septuagint translation, at least in this context. So therefore, in all other languages, it came to be written as Red Sea and not as Reed Sea. Now I said the Hebrew Bible uses the word suf, yam suf, and suf means reed. Do we have other instances in the Bible where the word suf is used and used in order to mean reed? Do we have other instances? Yes, we do have. Take for example, Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2 verses 3 and 5. That is the narration of how Moses was saved. Moses was saved. The mother of Moses prepared a basket and the infant was put in the basket. And it is said that basket was placed among the reeds. So the Hebrew word used there is among the suf. That was on the banks of river Nile, not along the Suez Canal, but that was on the banks of the river Nile. But there the Hebrew word used is suf, and the English translation used is reed. Now, is there another Hebrew word for red? If suf is reed, is there any other word for red in the biblical Hebrew? In the biblical Hebrew, there is another word for red, and that is Edom. Edom. That word appears in book of Genesis chapter 25 verse 30. We remember that instance of Jacob and Esau. When Jacob returned, Esau returned from the field. Jacob was drinking soup, and the soup was red in color. So there, the word used is red, and the Hebrew word used is Edom. Edom. So Hebrew word language did have another word, biblical Hebrew I am speaking of, did have another word for red, and that is Edom. Suf is reed. Book of Exodus chapter 3 verses 2 and 5 does use that translation. So from all this, what do I conclude? What I conclude is, as I said already, hoping that I am not scandalizing you or questioning your faith. God did perform an unimaginably wonderful act. There is no doubt about it. He led the people with his powerful hand through the dry land. But that miracle, God most probably performed at the place of the Red Sea, not necessarily at the place of Red Sea, because that is what the Bible would lead us to conclude. Why did I bring out this question once again? Now, I brought out this question because you are living in various countries, various cultures. I guess you will sometime or other come into interaction with the people of other faith and so on, those who question the truthfulness of the Bible. So in case somebody asks you, what foolishness is to say that people crossed the Red Sea, because geographically speaking, there was no need of going to the Red Sea in order to cross from Egypt to the Mount Sinai or Egypt to the wilderness. Geographically, that was not at all necessary. So what foolishness that you are saying? In case somebody asks you that question, or in case with your geographical knowledge, you yourself get this doubt, please keep in mind that this is the explanation. There is no need of doubting the truthfulness of the Bible, because truthfulness of the Bible basically is regarding the message that God communicates, not necessarily or always with regard to the minor narrative details. So having said that, now other things in the narration of crossing the Red Sea, I suppose we can quickly go over. Pharaoh's heart is once again hardened, and he will have the final blow from God. Pharaoh sends the army behind the Israelites, and God performs this wonderful act. You find that pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, which separates the people of Israel and the Egyptian army entire night, and God works a great miracle through Moses, cutting across the Red Sea and preparing a dry land through that dry land. The people pass very safely to the dry place, but the Egyptians follow them and they get drowned. And with that, the final blow over the Egyptians, and the Israelites are now safe. Chapter 15, we have got these two songs or hymns. Moses sings a song of victory, and afterwards Miriam also sings a song of history. Nothing much to say. It is just glorifying God and all that powerful hand of God. Now, once they are in the desert, in the wilderness, there are difficulties. The difficulties mainly in the wilderness is for food and drink. So right at the beginning, as soon as they reached wilderness, God performs these two miracles. One miracle of giving them water to drink, drinkable water, and the other miracle is miracle of giving bread from heaven. So that we notice in the book of Exodus chapter 15 verses 22 to 27. Nothing much to say there. There was water, but the water was very bitter and they cannot drink it. So they cried to God and to Moses. And Moses, after the instruction of God, took a staff, a rod, and put it in the water, and the water turned sweet. Sweet water in the sense water that is drinkable. So it became drinking water. So therefore, there were no more difficulties for water. And chapter 16 of book of Exodus narrates how God intervenes and performs a miracle and provides them food. And the food that God would provide them during the entire journey of Israel, called manna, is called manna. So a little bit of explanation about this God providing them with manna. But before that, something to say common regarding this miracle of God giving them water, and immediately after that, God giving them bread. Two symbols. Very important symbols in the entire Bible, also in the New Testament, water and manna. Water becomes a symbol of providence of God, but water would also be a symbol of God himself. So the water has a very, very symbolic meaning. It becomes very important in the religious history of the people of Israel. Later on for the Christians as well. Water becomes a very important symbol of the religion. Water represents God. Water represents the graces from God. And water also would represent cleansing. Water would represent the providence of God. Bread also as well. Jesus would say, I am the bread of life. So bread represents God himself. Bread represents also the providence of God. So I just want you to remember how these two important religious symbols, important both for the Old Testament and for the New Testament, how those two important religious symbols appear right at the beginning of the wilderness journey of Israelites. All through the journey which they will take up henceforward, this water and bread through which the presentation of God or manifestation of God, God's providence, God's strength will be always noticed. Another common observation that I want to make is they have just entered wilderness. In wilderness, their existence could be very well questioned or in danger. But right at the beginning of the wilderness journey, God makes it very clear, you don't have to be anxious at all. You don't have to be frightened at all. Believe in God and God will provide you all the necessities. Right at the beginning of the wilderness journey, God makes it very clear by providing them good water and good food. But in the entire wilderness journey, we will find that precisely is where the Israelites failed. They, in spite of this evidence, plenty of evidence from God of his providence, all through their journey, they will keep on questioning God, rebelling God. They will keep on doubting the power of God. And occasionally, they will get so desperate, they will question God so much, they will doubt the power of God so much, and so much so that they will also like to come back. So the nature of God as an all-providing God, and the nature of Israelites as always rebelling people, that comes out already at the beginning of the wilderness journey. That is an indication how the journey is going to proceed. God will be always a providing God, and Israelites will always be a doubting and rebellious people. So with that indication or that common observation, we come to the book of Exodus, chapter 16. One of the most beautiful chapters, one which appeals to our imagination, where God provides or feeds the people of Israel with the manna. The narration itself, the incident itself, since all of us are aware, I don't have to repeat, you just recall. I just bring to your attention a couple of details just for some clarification. Maybe you know it already. In case there are some who have not come across this, just to keep in mind. One, about the word manna itself. The food that God provided the people of Israel with in the land, in the wilderness, is called manna. From where did that word manna come? It is said very clearly, chapter 16, verse 15. The book of Exodus, chapter 16, verse 15. When the people got up in the morning, they saw this frost-like, dew-like thing. And they did not know what it is because they were not accustomed to the situation in the desert. They were people coming from the land of Egypt. So they did not know what this thing that they are seeing in the morning. So they asked the question which anybody would normally ask, what is it? What is it? And the Hebrew expression equivalent to what is it is manhu. Man, what, who, it. So what is it? Manhu. So from that question of the Hebrews, manhu, the name was received for that particular substance, manna. So what I'm saying is the word manna, what does it mean and from where did it come? Simply, it means what is it? And from where does it come? It comes from the question people asked when they first saw this early in the morning. Now, if you try to look at a kind of an intertestamental connection, Old Testament and New Testament connection, we all know quite well, we are all convinced this manna which God gave to the people of Israel in the wilderness is an anticipation, or we can also say a prefigurement, an anticipation of the body of Christ. That is the real manna Jesus would give. So the manna in the desert which God gave to the people of Israel is a pre-symbol, a prefigurement, an anticipation of the real manna which Jesus would give, and that is his own body. Quite interestingly, when the first manna was given in the desert, people approached that manna with a question. What is it? With a doubt. What is it? Similarly, in the New Testament, when the new manna is given, the body of Jesus is given, there also people will approach that manna with a question, with a doubt. Remember when Jesus spoke about the bread of life and Jesus giving his own body in the Gospel of John chapter 6, people could not believe. They asked, how is it? What is it? How can you give your body? And many of them left, saying that it is too difficult to grasp. So the first manna was given in the desert, and the response of the people was a doubt, a question. Similarly, when the real manna is given by Jesus, the response of people by and large would be a doubt, a question. Even today it continues. The non-believers still find it very, very difficult to accept. How can one find the body of Jesus in this host? Or how can one find the body of Jesus in this white small piece of bread? So manna always raised doubts and questions. Only a believer's heart will be able to accept it. And that is very clear in the incident of the first manna itself. So that is with regard to the name manna and the question related to it. As another clarification regarding the description of manna. concerning the taste of manna. I just want to bring to your attention chapter 16, verse 14. Chapter 16, verse 14. Chapter 16, verse 31. Chapter 16, verse 31, both from the book of Exodus, and book of Numbers, chapter 11. Book of Numbers, chapter 11, verses 7 to 8. 7 to 8. These verses give a description of the taste of manna. Taste of manna, it was like a wafer, it was like it had the taste of honey, and so on. Nothing very important, but just to bring to your attention regarding what the Old Testament people thought of the taste of manna. Another small clarification, look at Exodus chapter 16, verse 20. Exodus chapter 16, verse 20. We notice there Israelites were instructed very clearly by Moses that they should take manna that is necessary for one single day. Moses had told them very clearly that God would send manna every day. So you don't have to accumulate, gather too much of manna. You have to gather as much as manna that is necessary for one single day. But some of the Israelites were not very much believing in what Moses had said. They doubted. What if God forgets the next day to send manna? We will go hungry. So our prudence would say, our intelligence would say, according to the Israelites thought, collect some extra, so that in case God does not send tomorrow, we will have food to eat tomorrow. So the Israelites, some of them collected extra. But Exodus chapter 16, verse 20 says, what they collected more than what was required for that actual day, that could not be served, that could not be used, because ants came and ate it up and moths were there and all that. Well, from there arises this concept of daily bread, bread that is required for each day. And when I say the expression daily bread, immediately I'm sure you will recall how Jesus had made use of that concept in the prayer that he taught us. Give us this day our daily bread. So that expression, daily bread, in the prayer of the Lord, give us this day our daily bread, has its roots in this idea of manna, which is given for each day. One should not collect more than what is required for each day. What is the message from this expression, daily bread? And what is the message from this incident of manna not being able to be collected more than what is required for each day? The message is very clear. You ultimately depend on the providence of God. If you believe in God, if you trust in God, God will look after your needs. God will take care of your needs. Don't be over anxious about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of its own troubles. Jesus did say that. Don't worry too much about it tomorrow. Tomorrow will have its own worries and troubles. So that kind of an invitation to trust in God, trust in the providence of God, not to be too anxious. Of course, we need to take a sufficient care for our future, but not to be too anxious, over anxious. So that message is very clear here. Another point to be clarified, Exodus chapter 16, verse 21. Exodus chapter 16, verse 21, it is said, when the sun rises, the manna would disappear, because it was such a thin one, wafer, and when the sun rises, not merely because of the sunlight, there was this taste of sweet, honey sweetness in that manna. So when the sun rises, it's also possible ants or moths will come and take away whatever is left behind. Small particles, sweet taste. So therefore, it is quite natural. So that also might be one reason why the Bible says when the sun rises, the manna would disappear. Another point is chapter 16, verses 33 to 34. These are not very important theological points, but just to remember, chapter 16, verses 33 to 34, God gives an instruction to Moses that one omer is a kind of a measure they used in that time. So one omer of manna is to be taken and preserved for generations and generations. That is to be kept on the table of bread. or the table of the presence, as it used to be called, table of bread or table of presence in front of the ark. The tradition would say later on that omer of manna was shifted to inside the ark. Originally, it was supposed to be kept in front of the ark. Later on, it was shifted to inside the ark. So, Ark of the Covenant and this omer of manna. That manna would never be spoiled. Other manna which they were preserving for to eat for the day following, that would get spoiled. But this manna would not get spoiled. God instructed Moses that you will have to preserve it for generations and generations, so that the generations will know how God fed the people of Israel in the desert. Now, what happened to that manna which was preserved in the Ark of the Covenant? That question is related to what happened to the Ark itself. That we will answer when the description of the ark and the establishment of the Ark of the Covenant is spoken of in the book of Exodus from chapter 25 onwards. For that, we will wait a little more. So, having given this minor details, a little bit of a clarity regarding the things that is around or related to manna, now we come to the real question. Humanly speaking, what was this manna actually? Of course, it's a food. It's a bread that God showered from heaven for the people of Israel. But humanly speaking, what is this substance after all? Those of you who know the geography of the wilderness around Sinai might remember that this is a small particle, edible particle, which is available in very small quantity, very rarely, even today, in the Sinai Peninsula, as they call, in that Sinai desert area. This is a kind of a small edible particle, which very rarely, in very small quantity, could be found even in the modern time, manna. Now, what is it? Actually, that is, the explanation is, there is kind of a tree called the tamarisk tree. Tamarisk tree. Tamarisk, tamarisk tree. And on this tamarisk tree, there is a kind of a sap oozing. Now, in case there is someone of you who don't exactly understand what I mean, even in India, we have got certain trees from which a kind of a liquid, a sap comes out. Rubber tree, for example, or there are trees from which some kind of sap or some kind of liquid flows, but those liquids are not edible. Of course, those liquids are not edible, but this sap or the liquid that flows or that oozes out of the tree called tamarisk tree, some kind of insects, some kind of insects, a kind of insect which has got scales on it. Scales, you understand, the fish has got the scales on its body. So some kind of insects which has got the scales, they consume this what is called the sap that is oozing from the tamarisk tree. And these insects consume such a huge quantity of this sap. And once the insects consume this huge quantity of the sap or the liquid that flows from the tamarisk tree, that which they consume comes out, a kind of a secretion comes out of these insects. And that secretion, as soon as it comes out of the insect and comes in contact with the air, natural air, it becomes a little hard. It thickens. And it looks like droplets, small droplets. Those things are edible. That has got a kind of a taste of a honey wafer. It melts in the mouth. And so that is called a rational explanation, a natural explanation if you are looking for, a human explanation if you are looking for. That is what the manna, I repeat in summary form, manna is originally comes from the sap or a kind of a liquid that oozes from a tree called a tamarisk tree, and these kind of sects consume that sap in such huge quantity, and a secretion comes out of the sect and insects, and that secretion, as soon as it comes in contact with the air, natural air, it thickens a little bit and it becomes like droplets. Those droplets are edible, eatable, and it has got kind of a sweet taste and so on. Now, as I said, even in the modern time, in that Sinai area, rarely, if you are really lucky, occasionally, very rarely, in very small quantity, this can be found. So people think that is what is manna with which God fed the people of Israel. Naturally, the question is, what if that is such a natural thing? What about the miracle aspect of it? If it is a natural thing seen there in the Sinai Peninsula, what about the miracle aspect of it? Did God really perform a miracle, or was he making use of a natural phenomenon? Well, the miracle aspect, the miraculous intervention of God, as I said a little earlier also, we have no doubt. The miracle consists in the following aspects. One, the manna was available in such a huge quantity, which is not normal. As we said, the people who left out Egypt under the leadership of Moses was a rather big number. Even if it did not count as 18 lakhs or 6 lakhs or so, it was still a reasonably big number. And for such big number of people to be fed, to be filled, they need a huge quantity of manna. Such a huge quantity of manna was not normal. So there is a miraculous aspect God provided with the people of Israel. Even if manna was a natural thing, God provided in such huge quantity. Secondly, the manna was available for a long period of the time. The length of the duration during which manna was available really is a miracle. God fed the people of Israel almost for 40 years. As I said, even today, manna sometimes, very rarely, occasionally can be found, but not regularly for such a long time. So the length of the duration during which manna was given certainly calls for a wonderful miracle. And the third element in the miracle is the circumstances in which or with which manna was given. What do I mean by the circumstances? On the previous day of the Sabbath, there would be double the share of manna showered from heaven, as if it were. A double share of manna would be showered from heaven on the previous day of Sabbath. And what they collect on the previous day of Sabbath would not get spoiled. Whereas on the day of Sabbath, no manna would be seen. So those circumstances also calls for a miraculous intervention of God. So three things at least calls definitely for a miraculous intervention of God. The huge quantity in which it was given, the very long duration of the time during which manna was given without any hindrance, and the special circumstances with which manna was given to the people of Israel. So chapter 16 speaks about this miracle of God feeding them with manna, and how miraculous it is. What is the miracle? What is manna? What is it naturally? And how that name came, and what are its connections with the New Testament manna, which is the body of Jesus himself. So with that, now since it is time, I guess we can conclude the study session tomorrow. From study session of today, tomorrow we will take up the class from chapter 17 onwards.